It was a tranquil Saturday morning, as it often was when David immersed himself in the serenity of his garden. The soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant melodies of birdsong felt like a well-deserved reprieve after a grueling week. Yet the fragile peace was broken by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. David looked up, spotting Greg, his next-door neighbor, approaching with an expression that stopped him in his tracks. A peculiar mix of nervousness and gravity. David straightened up from pruning his plants, brushing soil from his hands onto his gardening apron. Greg didn't usually disturb him like this. Their exchanges were typically limited to brief nods or casual conversation about weather patterns or lawn maintenance. "Morning, Greg," David greeted cautiously. "What's on your mind?" Greg glanced around, his demeanor unusually guarded. When he finally spoke, his voice came out low and hesitant. "David, we need to talk." There was an edge to his words that immediately unsettled David. He had never seen Greg this tense. "All right," David replied, curiosity flickering in his tone. "What's going on?" Greg stepped closer, lowering his gaze before locking eyes with David, something he rarely did. "This isn't easy for me to say," he began slowly, the weight of his confession visible in the way he shifted nervously. "It's about Rachel." Hearing his wife's name spoken with such strange familiarity sent an uneasy jolt through David, but before he could react, Greg pushed forward. "I've been obsessed with her." The words felt like a thunderclap in David's ears. For a moment he thought he must have misheard. "What exactly are you saying, Greg?" he asked sharply, trying to mask the storm brewing inside him. Greg hesitated, looking almost as if he might bolt, but finally admitted what had been tormenting him. His voice trembled with guilt as he explained how he had secretly nurtured feelings for Rachel for years. He confessed that those feelings had spiraled into something darker, an obsession that had driven him to secretly watch and even worse record her. "I know it's terrible, David," Greg stammered, looking down as though unable to meet his neighbor's piercing gaze. "But I swear, I'm not trying to hurt you. I couldn't stand the idea of her being hurt, of losing her to someone else." David's chest tightened. Each word Greg uttered made the situation feel more surreal. "Recording," he repeated slowly, his voice heavy with incredulity. To David's horror, Greg pulled out his phone with shaking hands and tapped on the screen. He began showing a series of videos he had taken without Rachel's knowledge, clips of her watering plants, chatting on her phone outside, or leaving the house for errands. But there was something stranger and far more troubling in these recordings. In several of them, an unfamiliar man appeared, entering David's home during times he knew he wasn't there. "That man?" Greg said, his voice barely above a whisper as he pointed to the screen. "I've seen him go into your house often when you're not around. I thought you should know." David froze as his eyes locked on the footage. His pulse quickened. Each beat echoed with anger and confusion. Staring at the unfamiliar man and the casual familiarity with which Rachel greeted him, David felt his stomach churn. He turned toward Greg, glaring with a mixture of shock and fury. "You've been spying on my wife, and now you're parading this invasion of privacy in front of me? Who gave you that right?" Greg flinched at the outburst, raising his hands defensively. "I know I crossed the line," he admitted hurriedly, his tone desperate now. "But I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I thought she might be cheating on you. I mean, you deserve to know if that's happening." For a moment, all David could do was glare at Greg. His fists clenched tightly at his sides as conflicting emotions surged through him. Anger at the violation of their privacy, disbelief at what these recordings revealed, and now a gnawing seed of doubt about Rachel's behavior. With effort, he composed himself slightly and took Greg's phone from him. Scrolling through the videos again in grim silence, the same man appeared repeatedly in various clips, always entering through the front door without hesitation and staying while David was typically at work. His presence was unmistakable. "You spent years watching my wife," David said bitterly as he handed the phone back to Greg with disgust. "And now you think this justifies it?" "I only wanted to protect her," Greg insisted weakly. David didn't say a word. He just pulled out his phone and opened the video Greg had shown him. He slid it across the table toward Rachel, screen facing her. She picked it up cautiously, her brows furrowing. As she watched, her expression shifted from confusion to shock. When it was over, she slowly placed the phone back on the table, her eyes wide. Who did this? She asked, indignation flashing in her voice. Who's been recording me? David's gaze didn't waver. That's not what matters right now, Rachel. What matters is who that man is. The one coming into our house when I'm not here. He shows up multiple times in these videos. Who is he? Rachel stayed silent for a few moments, as if weighing her words carefully. Finally, she looked him in the eye. David, I haven't cheated on you. I would never do that. You have to trust me. Trust you. David repeated, the frustration creeping into his voice. He pushed himself up, pacing the room. How am I supposed to trust you when there's some guy coming into our house, and you never mentioned it? How do you explain this, Rachel? She stayed calm even as his voice echoed through the room. I can't explain it right now. It's not the right time. But I need you to trust me. David stopped, turning to her with an incredulous look. Not the right time, Rachel. We're talking about something that could destroy our marriage. How can you ask me to wait? Rachel stood too, folding her arms across her chest. I know it sounds strange, but you need to trust me. All I can say right now is that you're wrong about this. When the time is right, I'll tell you, but not now. That's all you have to say? Not now. He shook his head, almost laughing at the absurdity. You're asking for trust while hiding something from me? Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes resolute, but she didn't say another word. David knew that he wasn't getting any more answers from her tonight. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The weight of her words echoed in his mind over and over. You have to trust me. David spent the entire night tossing and turning, his mind spiraling. Rachel's insistence. You have to trust me. It's not the right time to talk about this. Looped endlessly in his head. By morning, frustration had peaked. He needed answers one way or another. Determined, he left the house earlier than usual, but instead of going to work, he parked his car down the street with a clear view of his own house. Sitting there, engine off, he stared at the front door. It felt uncomfortable, wrong even, to be spying on his own wife, but he was desperate for the truth. Hours passed as he watched Rachel go about her day, seemingly unfazed. She opened the windows, tidied up the garden, routine things. But just before noon, an old car pulled up in front of the house. David's pulse quickened as he recognized it from Greg's recordings. His anger flared as he saw the man step out, tall with a stern expression, carrying a plain bag over his shoulder. David leaned forward, watching as the man rang the doorbell. Rachel opened it almost immediately. She didn't look nervous or uncomfortable. In fact, she looked relieved to see him. They exchanged words. David couldn't hear a thing from his car. But then Rachel stepped aside, letting him in. A sick feeling twisted in David's gut. Who was this man, and why was Rachel so at ease with him, yet unwilling to explain his presence? He gripped the steering wheel, fighting the urge to rush into the house and demand answers. But he held himself back. He needed to know more first. After about an hour, the man left, glancing around briefly before getting into his car and driving away. Once the man was out of sight, David got out of his car and headed back to the house. He stepped in quietly and found Rachel in the kitchen, looking distracted. When she heard his footsteps, she turned, and for a fleeting moment, he caught something in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe worry. Who was he? David asked directly, his voice steady but demanding. Rachel took a deep breath, almost as if she had expected this question. I told you, you need to trust me. Trust. David's frustration boiled over. How can I trust you when there's a man coming into our house that I've never seen before? Who is he, Rachel? He stepped closer, refusing to back down this time. Rachel crossed her arms, staying calm and steady. He's my brother, David. David froze, caught off guard. Your brother? You never mentioned you had a brother. Rachel looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Because he's been in prison. For 10 years. David felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He stared at her, trying to process. Prison, he echoed. For what? She hesitated, then answered. He made mistakes when he was younger. He got involved in theft. But he's paid for it, David. He got out recently and is trying to rebuild his life. I'm the only family he has. David rubbed his face, struggling to take it all in. And why didn't you tell me? Why hide something like this from me? Because I knew how you'd react. she replied, her voice heavy with emotion. I knew you'd be suspicious, that you'd question everything. I just wanted to give him a chance to get back on his feet before telling you. David shook his head, feeling a mix of relief and hurt. Relief that it wasn't an affair, but hurt that she'd kept something this big from him. I don't know what to think, Rachel. But hiding it wasn't fair. I know, she said softly. But he's my brother, David. He needs me, and I needed you to trust me. David looked at her, unsure of what to say. The pieces were falling into place, but there was a nagging feeling in his gut, like there was more to the story. He knew this conversation wasn't over. Later that night, while Rachel was in the shower, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Against his better judgment, he took her phone. He knew it was wrong, but his suspicions got the better of him. He unlocked it, searching for any sign of this brother she'd never mentioned. There were no recent messages to anyone named Mark, the name she had given for her brother. Just one unidentified number that kept appearing in her call logs over the past few months. David wrote it down, determined to investigate further. The next day during lunch, he called the number from a public phone, his heart racing. After a few rings, a deep, tired voice answered. Hello. The voice sounded wary. David hesitated, then spoke up. Who is this? Who's asking? The response was guarded, quick. My name's David. I'm Rachel's husband, he said, trying to sound steady. There was a long pause, then the voice softened. I'm Mark. A strange mix of anger and relief washed over David. Finally, he was talking to the man who'd been coming to his house. He pressed on. Rachel said you're her brother, that you just got out of prison. I want to hear it from you. Mark let out a sigh. It's true. I spent 10 years in prison. But I'm trying to put my life back together. Rachel's helping me because no one else will. I know it seems strange, but she's just trying to be a good sister. David wasn't convinced. Then why didn't I know about any of this? Why didn't she tell me you even existed? Mark paused. She wanted to protect you. And honestly, I didn't want you to know either. Telling someone you've been to prison isn't easy. You carry that forever. There was a sincerity in Mark's voice that caught David off guard. But something still didn't sit right with him. If it's all so simple, why does it feel like there's more you're not telling me? Mark was quiet for a moment. Because it's hard to ask someone to trust you after all I've done. I just want a chance to start fresh. Rachel believes in me. You should believe in her too. David hung up without another word. Mark's words echoed in his mind, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the story was incomplete. He started to wonder if Rachel had kept all of this from him because she knew he'd have trouble handling the truth. But the weight of these secrets gnawed at him. That evening when he got home, he found Rachel in the living room, her face serious, almost like she knew what he'd done. You called Mark, didn't you? She asked, straight to the point. David nodded. I had to. You're asking me to trust you, but you're not giving me any reason to. Rachel sighed, rubbing her face in frustration. I know this is hard, David, but Mark's already been through so much. I wanted to tell you everything when the time was right. But now it feels like we're handling this in the worst way possible. Then tell me now, he insisted. Don't make me find things out on my own. Don't hide anything else. Rachel hesitated, and just as she was about to respond, her phone rang. She looked at the screen, then answered it immediately, stepping away to speak quietly. David watched, his frustration growing. Even after everything, it felt like the distance between them was only widening. He stood frozen in the living room, watching her speak in a hushed tone. She slipped into the hallway, as if to avoid him hearing. That only deepened his mistrust. The call felt like yet another piece of a puzzle he couldn't seem to solve. He sat on the couch, trying to calm the anger simmering inside him. The room felt colder and emptier, the silence between them growing heavier. Rachel came back a few minutes later, looking worn out but resolute. That was Mark, she said before he could ask. She sat across from him, leaning forward, elbows on her knees. He's dealing with more problems than I expected. That's why I've been so involved. He has no one else but me, David. David took a deep breath, leaning forward. Rachel, I get that you want to help your brother. Really, I do. But don't you see how much you've left me out of this? You asked me to trust you, but you haven't given me a single reason to. Every new detail feels like it's being dragged out of you. Rachel lowered her head for a moment, then looked up, resolute. I was trying to protect you, David. And yes, to protect Mark too. What he went through wasn't just prison. He got involved with dangerous people. People who haven't forgotten what he did. David's heart raced. Dangerous people? What do you mean by that? Is he in some kind of trouble? Rachel nodded slowly. Before he was arrested, Mark was involved in something bigger. He went to prison for theft, but the group he was with did much worse. While he was in prison, he managed to cut ties with them, but now that he's out, they want something from him. I don't know exactly what, but he's scared. David felt a chill down his spine. The idea that their home was being used as a hiding place without his knowledge was terrifying. He stood up and started pacing. This is dangerous, Rachel. If these people are as bad as you say, it's not just Mark who's at risk, it's you. It's us. Rachel stood, walked over and took his hands. I know this seems crazy, but I couldn't abandon him. He's my brother. I had to help. But now that you know everything, we need to decide together what to do. David looked into her eyes, seeing the worry she carried. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling there was more unsaid. But he knew now wasn't the time to push. He nodded, squeezing her hands. We'll face this together. But Rachel, this has to stop. We can't let your brother's past put us in danger. He needs to face this once and for all. Rachel agreed, and they stood there in silence, gathering strength for what lay ahead. David knew things wouldn't be easy, but he finally felt like they were handling this as a team. They decided it was time for David to meet Mark properly. After all that had happened, David needed to understand the man who'd been taking refuge in their home. Mark arrived that afternoon, looking humble but resolute. Knowing the situation was complicated and wanting to show he wasn't a threat to Rachel or David, Rachel prepared some food. David led Mark to the living room. They sat face to face, the atmosphere tense but not hostile. I need to be honest with you, Mark, David began. I found out about you because Greg, our neighbor, showed me recordings of Rachel. He's been obsessed with her. Mark's eyes widened. He recorded my sister? He asked, shocked and angry. And why did you let that happen, David? David sighed, the guilt weighing on him. I didn't know until he showed me. That's how this all started. He thought you were someone else involved with Rachel. But now that I know the truth, I want to settle this once and for all. Mark's expression darkened. So he invaded her privacy, recording her without her consent? This guy needs to learn a lesson. David hesitated, unsure of what Mark had in mind. But before he could respond, Mark continued. We need to give this guy a scare. Nothing extreme, just enough to make sure he never tries anything like this again. David considered it. He didn't like the idea of threats, but he knew Greg had crossed the line. He finally nodded. All right, but no extremes, Mark. This ends here. With their plan set, David went to Greg's house that afternoon. Greg opened the door with his usual smug expression, but his face changed as David began to speak. That man you recorded at my house wasn't my wife's lover, Greg. He's her brother. And he just got out of prison. 10 years, Greg. And now he knows exactly what you've done. Greg turned pale, but David didn't wait for a reply. He gave a curt smile, turned and walked away, leaving Greg to grapple with the news. Minutes later, Mark knocked on Greg's door. When Greg answered, he found Mark standing there with a menacing look. Before Greg could say a word, Mark punched him squarely, knocking him to the ground. Greg clutched his face, terrified as he looked up. If you ever record my sister again, Mark said, his voice calm but firm, it won't just end here. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. Got it? Greg nodded, too scared to look Mark in the eye. Mark pointed a finger at him. This is your only warning. When Mark returned to Rachel's house, he was calmer. The three of them sat together, and Mark gave them a sad smile. I can't stay here. If I do, I'll just bring more trouble. I have a friend in Brazil who can help me start over. I can live there peacefully, without looking over my shoulder. Rachel tried to protest, but Mark shook his head. I've made up my mind. And this time I'll do things the right way. Thank you for everything. The following days were full of goodbyes and preparation. David and Rachel knew Mark was heading toward a better life, but they couldn't help feeling his absence. Shortly after he left, David made another big decision. This house, these neighbors, they're just not working, Rachel. Let's sell everything and move somewhere quiet. No nosy neighbors, no problems. Rachel agreed, and together they began planning a fresh start. David wanted somewhere secluded, where they could finally have the peace they needed. It was a new chapter, and both of them were ready to leave the past behind and focus on the future they would build together. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.